January 12th, 1682. The Kremlin, the anteroom of the royal palace. A bonfire, not of enemy pamphlets, not of rebel flags, of government records. The order had been issued by Tsar Fyodor Alexeyevich, son of Alexis, grandson of the first Romanov, and within hours, state officials were feeding 2 centuries of appointment books into the flames. Every record of who held what position, every note of which family served which prince, every name that might one day justify a claim to power that wasn't theirs to give. The official story calls this a reform, the abolition of the mesnichestvo system, the Byzantine practice of assigning military and administrative rank based on ancestral precedents rather than personal ability. Burning the registers, the story goes, was a practical solution to a bureaucratic nightmare. Progressive, even. Think through what that actually required. To abolish a legal norm, you write a new law. You issue a decree. The old records become irrelevant by themselves, superseded, archived, forgotten. Governments have been doing this for as long as governments have existed. They do not carry state registers into throne rooms and set them on fire. There is one situation where you need the physical documents gone, when the documents themselves are the threat, when what they contain, the names, the hierarchies, the chains of authority going back to before your family existed, could be used against you. The Romanovs had been on the throne for 69 years by that January fire, and they still felt unsafe enough to burn the paperwork. Think about what that means. Before we get to the fire, we need to talk about a child. The year is 1614. 1 year after the Zemsky Sobor, the Assembly of the Land, declared Mikhail Romanov the rightful Tsar of Russia. The Romanov dynasty is newly established, the ink barely dry on their founding documents, and they are already executing a problem. The problem is 3 years old. His name was Ivan, son of Marina Mniszek and the man known as False Dmitry II. His grandfather, by blood, was a Rurikid, a member of the dynasty that had ruled Russia for 7 centuries before the Romanovs arrived. In the eyes of a significant portion of the Russian nobility, this 3-year-old boy had a better claim to the throne than Mikhail Romanov. So they hanged him, publicly, in Moscow. Now, you can debate the politics of the time of troubles. You can argue about legitimacy and succession crises. But I want you to hold one simple fact. Legitimate kings do not hang toddlers. When a dynasty's right to rule is genuinely established and recognized, a 3-year-old orphan is not a threat. He is a footnote. You put him in a monastery, give him a new name, and he disappears from history as a monk. That is what secure dynasties do with rival children. When you hang him publicly, when you need him demonstrably, verifiably, permanently gone, it means you know your claim is fragile. It means you know that someone, someday, might hold that child up and say, "This is the real heir." A dynasty with a genuinely uncontested claim to the throne does not make a public example of a toddler. You put him in a monastery. You give him a monk's name. He disappears into prayer, and no one ever mentions him again. That is the move of a government that knows it has time on its side. You stage that kind of death in public, for an audience, in Moscow, with witnesses, only when you need everyone to understand that this particular lineage is closed, permanently. that there is no version of the future where this child or his memory becomes useful to anyone. And Ivan Voronok, the little thief's son, as they called him, was just the first entry in a very long list. Here is a test you can run yourself. Find a copy of the Utverzhchonaya Gramota, the confirmed charter of 1613, the document that supposedly records the unanimous election of Mikhail Romanov by a representative assembly of the Russian people. This document is the founding legal instrument of the entire dynasty. It is their constitution, their mandate from God and nation. Now find the confirmed charter of 1598, the document that records the election of Boris Godunov to the same throne. Read them side by side. Large sections of the 1613 charter are copied word for word from the 1598 one. Not paraphrased, not adapted, copied. Scholars who have examined the original manuscripts have noted that multiple signature blocks appear to be written in the same hand. The assembly that supposedly produced a spontaneous outpouring of national unity appears, on close examination, to have produced a document written by a small number of chancery officials working from a template. The charitable reading is that this was standard chancellery practice. Medieval bureaucrats working from established forms, copying the structure of a previous legitimation document, the way you might copy a legal template. Except that, even then, what you are left with is a founding instrument that is not a spontaneous expression of popular will. It is a form letter with the name changed. But there is a harder question. The Zemsky Sobor of 1613 was held under the effective military occupation of Moscow by Cossack forces loyal to candidates they preferred. Multiple contemporary accounts describe delegates voting under duress. Mikhail Romanov was not the assembly's first choice. He was the choice the Cossacks were willing to accept without burning the city again. This is not a dynasty that emerged from popular acclaim. This is a dynasty that emerged from exhaustion, from a population so devastated by 15 years of civil war that they would ratify almost anything that promised to stop the killing. The Romanovs understood this, which is why they spent the next 200 years making absolutely certain no one could go back and verify the details. Drive to Rostov-Veliki today. Not Rostov-on-Don, Rostov the Great, in the Yaroslavl region, northeast of Moscow. It is a quiet provincial town, famous for its Kremlin and its enamel workshops. Walk to the edge of town and look down from slightly elevated ground, or pull up a satellite image. What you will see is a 9-pointed star. 2 kilometers of earthen ramparts, still visible from space, forming a geometric figure of extraordinary precision. A classic Tres Italienne star fortress, the kind built across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries to withstand artillery fire. The official date of construction, 1631 to 1633. Engineer, Jan Cornelius van Rodenburg, a Dutch specialist hired by Tsar Mikhail Romanov as part of Russia's military modernization program. 2 problems, neither of them small. First, location. In 1631, Rostov-Veliki was not a frontier town under threat of attack. It sat deep in the Russian interior, hundreds of kilometers from any meaningful military threat. You do not build a state-of-the-art artillery fortress in your heartland to defend against an enemy who is nowhere near your heartland. Second, the engineering itself. A star fortress is not a ditch with ambition. It is geometry turned into military power, angles calculated for artillery deflection, slopes cut to precise gradients, fields of fire overlapping at exact coordinates. You cannot eyeball a 9-pointed star. You need surveying instruments, ballistic mathematics, and the kind of technical knowledge that, according to the official narrative of Russian history, would not exist in this country for another 70 years. The standard explanation is that von Rodenburg imported both the knowledge and the method. Fine. Then show me the logistics. 2 kilometers of precisely engineered earthworks in 2 years requires a workforce numbered in the thousands, a continuous supply of timber and iron tools, and a project management structure sophisticated enough to maintain geometric tolerances across the entire perimeter. The archive that would contain those supply records was in Moscow. It no longer exists. That alone does not settle the matter, but it does shift the burden of explanation considerably. One version. Van Rodenburg surveyed, described, and partially restored fortifications that were already there. That he was not building from zero, but from something that predated the Romanovs, something that needed a Dutch name attached to it to become officially legible. Look at the shape from above. Then ask, what kind of civilization builds a 9-pointed star in a field in the Russian interior, and when? Peter I founded St. Petersburg in 1703. This is one of the most famous facts in Russian history. The great Tsar who dragged a medieval kingdom into modernity, who built a European capital on a swamp at the edge of the known world, who willed a city into existence through sheer force of imperial ambition. The archaeology does not cooperate with this story. In 2006, excavations began on Okhtinsky Cape, a promontory at the confluence of the Okhta and Neva rivers in what is now St. Petersburg. The excavations were commissioned ahead of a planned construction project. What they found caused the construction to be paused for 4 years. They found Nienchans, the Swedish fortress that Peter supposedly captured and demolished, the thing that was supposedly the only significant structure in the area before 1703. That was expected. But beneath Nienchans, they found the remains of Landskrona, a 13th century Swedish fortification. And beneath Landskrona, they found something else. Wooden roads, stone foundations, water management infrastructure, evidence of continuous settlement going back well before any of the official dates. The lead archaeologist, Pyotr Sorokin, published his findings. The site was subsequently designated a cultural heritage monument. The results of 4 years of excavation are now physically sealed beneath a concrete preservation layer, awaiting study that has not been funded. Peter did not build on emptiness. That much the ground itself has confirmed. And then there is the stone. The granite embankments of St. Petersburg, the ones that line the Neva for kilometers, the ones in every photograph of the city, are constructed from blocks of a size and weight that pose a serious engineering question. Moving granite monoliths of several hundred tons along a riverbank requires either large modern lifting equipment or a system of manual engineering of a sophistication that sits awkwardly with the official image of Peter's workforce. Conscripted serfs, arriving at the building site for the first time, working under conditions that killed them by the tens of thousands. You can explain one anomaly with exceptional engineers. You cannot explain an entire pattern with exceptional engineers every single time. At some point, construction starts looking suspiciously like inheritance. If that is true, then the most famous origin story in Russian history is a cover story. And the question becomes, covering what? 1682. Moscow. The state appointment books are burned. 1737. Moscow again. A fire destroys a significant portion of the Moscow archives, including materials from the Posolsky Prikaz, the Foreign Office, dating back to the 16th century. 1812. Moscow again. Napoleon's army occupies the city. The city burns. When the smoke clears, the private collection of Count Alexei Musin-Pushkin is gone. With it goes the original manuscript of the Lay of Igor's Campaign, the most celebrated text of medieval Russian literature, along with the Laurentian Chronicle and dozens of other unique documents. 3 fires, 3 generations apart, 3 different causes: state policy, accident, war. 3 times the documents that could have served as independent checks on the official version of Russian history are reduced to ash. No serious historian needs to claim coordination here. The point is not intent. The point is outcome. Nikolai Karamzin was the official imperial historian, appointed by Tsar Alexander I. He spent the first decade of the 1800s writing The History of the Russian State, 12 volumes that became the canonical account of Russian history and remained the foundational text for generations of subsequent historians. He finished his 9th volume in 1820. The Moscow Fire was 1812. When Karamzin cited primary sources, when he quoted from chronicles, from charters, from documents that formed the basis of his account, the originals of many of those documents were in the private collections that burned. What survives is Karamzin's account, Karamzin's quotations, and Karamzin's interpretations. The things you would need to check his work against are gone. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a provenance problem. In any serious archival discipline, a historical claim whose primary source documentation has been destroyed, and which exists now only in the paraphrase of a single court-appointed historian, is treated with significant caution. We do not treat Karamzin with caution. We treat him as the foundation, because there is nothing else to treat. In 1749, a German historian named Gerhard Friedrich Müller presented a paper to the Imperial Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. The paper was titled, "On the Origins of the Name and People of Russia." Its central argument was that the Russian state had been founded by Scandinavian Vikings, the Varangians, who arrived in the 9th century and organized a population that had no political tradition of its own. Mikhail Lomonosov, the one Russian-born scholar of significant stature in the academy at that time, objected strenuously. He accused Müller of deliberately misreading the sources, of selectively ignoring evidence that contradicted his thesis, and of constructing a narrative that was politically useful rather than historically accurate. Specifically, Lomonosov pointed to chronicles that described complex diplomatic and trade relationships between Slavic peoples and neighboring states well before any Varangian arrival. Relationships that implied existing political structures, not a tribal vacuum waiting to be organized by Scandinavian management. The Academy sided with Müller. Lomonosov was placed under house arrest. The charges against him included insubordination and insult to foreign members of the Academy. He faced a death sentence, later commuted. The Norman theory, the idea that Russians required outside founders to become civilized, became the official doctrine of Imperial Russian historiography and remained largely dominant for 200 years. Now, ask yourself why this matters to the Romanovs. By 1749, the dynasty's bloodline had already significantly shifted. Peter II had been the last male Romanov. The current empress, Elizabeth, was Peter the Great's daughter, technically a Romanov. But her nephew and successor, who would become Peter III, was a German prince from Holstein-Gottorp who had been brought to Russia and groomed for the throne. His wife, who would depose him and rule as Catherine II, was also German, from Anhalt-Zerbst. From 1762 onward, the dynasty ruling Russia was, by any genealogical measure, the House of Holstein-Gottorp. The Romanov name was retained as a brand, but the blood was German. Against this backdrop, what does it do for your legitimacy if the official historical doctrine holds that Russia has always required foreign founders to function? That the very origin of the Russian state is a story of outsiders arriving to organize a people who couldn't organize themselves? It makes the German dynasty seem like a continuation rather than an imposition. Lomonosov saw the mechanism clearly, which is presumably why the full archive of Müller's Siberian expedition, the Miller portfolios, thousands of documents collected from Siberian monasteries during a decade of travel through regions that official historiography had barely touched, has never been fully published. Portions remain restricted. Portions are listed as lost. A German historian traveled through regions of Russia with no prior Western documentation, gathered documents describing civilizations and structures that didn't fit the official narrative, and the results of that expedition are still not fully available. What was in those monasteries? What did he find before he decided what the history would say? On the night of December 31st, 1699, Russia was in the year 7208 from the creation of the world. On the morning of January 1st, 1700, Russia was in the year 1700 from the birth of Christ. By decree of Peter I, 7,208 years of recorded time were simply abolished. The old calendar, used in Russia for centuries, used in every church record, every land deed, every genealogical document, was discarded overnight. Peter announced that Russia would align with European practice. This is always presented as modernization. Russia joining the civilized world of European timekeeping. Calendar changes are not neutral. Every document written before the change requires translation into the new system. Every date in every archive becomes, in effect, a foreign language that must be interpreted by someone trained to convert it. The further back you go, into the 15th century, the 14th, the 13th, the more that interpretation depends on the accuracy of the scholarly apparatus performing it. Consider what this means in practical terms. Land grants, property deeds, monastic records of endowments, the documents that established who owned what and on what historical basis, were written in the old system. After 1700, challenging an interpretation of one of those documents required navigating a conversion that most people could not perform themselves. You were dependent, for the reading of your own past, on scholars licensed by the state. That apparatus was built by Müller and Karamzin and the historians of the Imperial Academy. The old Russian year count was based on the Byzantine calculation of the date of creation. 7,000 years of counting connected Russian institutional life to an unbroken chain of Byzantine ecclesiastical record-keeping. That chain, once cut, cannot be reconnected except by going through the people who claim to understand both ends. One decree, one night, and every document written before 1700 becomes dependent on the interpretation of imperial scholars for its meaning. It doesn't just erase documents. It makes the surviving documents harder to read independently. It inserts a layer of required expertise between the original text and any reader who wants to verify it without asking permission first. That is not modernization. That is a lock placed on the filing cabinet after the bonfire. Let me give you what we have, and let you draw the line. 1613. A founding charter that copies its predecessor word for word, produced under military duress, with signatures that may have been added later. 1614. The public execution of a 3-year-old boy with a better claim to the throne to ensure there was no rival lineage to rally around. 1682. The physical incineration of 2 centuries of state appointment records, replaced by new genealogical books compiled from petitions submitted to the very regime that destroyed the originals. 1683 to 1700. The systematic replacement of the old ecclesiastical calendar with a European one, severing the documentary chain connecting contemporary Russia to pre-Romanov institutional life. 1703. The founding of a new capital on a site where, according to recent archaeology, significant prior construction already existed. A founding myth built on a site that was not, in fact, empty. 1749. The official adoption of a historical doctrine holding that Russians had no self-generated political civilization before the arrival of Scandinavian outsiders, enforced by the arrest of the scholar who disagreed. 1761. The transfer of the dynasty to a German bloodline, which then ruled under the Russian name for 157 years. 1812. The destruction, in the Moscow fire, of the private collections containing the original manuscripts that formed the documentary basis of the official history being written by the court historian at that exact moment. Each of these events has a clean, individual explanation. The calendar change is modernization. The archive fire is war. The Norman theory is scholarship. The charter is standard legal practice. But look at what they accomplish together. Before the Romanovs, Russian history is a zone of managed uncertainty. The documents that would let you independently verify what the pre-Romanov world looked like. Who held power, what structures existed, what the demographic and political geography actually was. Those documents are either gone, dependent on Romanov-era interpretation, or still sitting in partially closed archives. After the Romanovs finished their work, Russian history before 1613 looks exactly the way they needed it to look. Primitive, chaotic, requiring rescue by a new dynasty that happened to be deeply aligned with European powers. This is not a conspiracy. A conspiracy requires a secret meeting, a signed agreement, a cabal with minutes of their proceedings. What I am describing is something older and simpler. It is institutional logic. When you take power under questionable circumstances, every action you take afterward is shaped by the need to make those circumstances look less questionable. You don't need to plan a cover-up. You just need to consistently choose, at every decision point, the option that makes you look more legitimate. The Romanovs made that choice for 300 years. They made it when they burned the books. They made it when they hired German historians. They made it when they picked a court historian and let the archives burn around him. The result is the history we were taught. Set them beside any dynasty that did not need to invent itself. The Habsburgs preserved the records of every predecessor they displaced. So did the Bourbons. So did the Capetians. Because those records were safe. They showed a line of succession that eventually led to you. The documents of your predecessors are the foundation of your own legitimacy. You do not burn them. You build institutions to hold them. The contrast is the point. The Romanovs burned, replaced, re-narrated, and redated. They appointed a court historian at the exact moment the documents he would have cited were being destroyed. They adopted a scientific doctrine that told the Russian people they had never produced a civilization worth documenting before foreigners arrived to help. They governed under a name that, by the middle of the 18th century, no longer reflected the actual bloodline sitting on the throne. None of these things individually proves what the Romanovs were erasing. What they were replacing had its own institutions, its own hierarchies, its own infrastructure. Star fortresses in provincial fields, stone foundations under river deltas, calendar systems connected to centuries of ecclesiastical record. Call it what you want. Historians call it pre-Romanov Russia and treat it as an underdeveloped prelude to the imperial period. The material evidence in the ground, the archaeology at Okhtinsky Cape, the earthworks at Rostov-Veliki, the fragments of records that survived despite everything, suggest something more coherent than that, more organized, harder to explain away. The Romanovs spent 300 years making sure you would never find out exactly how coherent. And the most interesting question now is not what they were replacing. The most interesting question is, why did they work so hard to make it look like there was nothing there to replace? What does a dynasty fear about a past that it controls so completely? What does absolute erasure protect against? Because the Romanovs did not merely govern a country, they managed a story. And every story that requires this much management has a version underneath it that someone, somewhere, decided you should never hear.